Hello, we're going to take a look at some VM stuff. I can honestly tell you that 5 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about VMs in this class. But virtual machines have become so huge, and that is because the processing power of our computers has become so great that we can run VMs and they just work like butter, and we don't have a problem like we used to have. So virtualization, again, been around since the 50s, making mainframes do something that another computer would have done and making it do it on its hardware. I used virtualization back when I was your age, but you know what? It was slow and it was cumbersome because the CPUs and the RAM were very limited. Storage was very limited. And now we've got tons of storage, tons of RAM, tons of processors, and we can run virtualization all the time. In our 113 class, we get into that heavily, and you install VirtualBox and you run another version of Windows 10 if you want, and you run Linux in there so you can do all the assignments within these virtual machines. I'll have students that will go out and get the awesome computer, the biggest computer, not the biggest, but as far as specs go, the biggest computer they can get. And some will go, yeah, I got 32 gigs of RAM. Well, you're never going to use 32 gigs of RAM unless you're doing virtualization. There might be a game out there that really wants 32 gigs of RAM, but for the most part, no. 16 gigs is a lot. 8 is more than enough. So the times that 8 would become a problem, I want to do a lot of virtualization. In other words, I want to run other operating systems on top of the operating system I have. It's become such a huge thing that down in the BIOS, you should mention it someplace here, down in the BIOS, they actually have virtual machine settings. There we are, enable VT in the BIOS. Yeah, these little things are about going into the BIOS settings and saying, I'm going to run virtualization, and it makes things faster. I have seen that from 2003, sometime around there, and the VT settings were off. So the BIOS would start up and those were always off, and you'd have to go in and turn it on. These days on your computer, it's normally just on. In other words, virtualization is used so much that they just have those settings on. What is a virtual machine? What are we really talking about? You are talking about running an OS inside an OS when you're dealing with personal things. So right here, hardware and virtual machines, you have the hardware, the CPU, the memory, the network card, the disks, all the hardware that Windows is recognizing. We're going to use Windows as an example. And then you install hypervisor. That is the term we use for the program that allows you to have VMs in it. VirtualBox is a free one, and I'm actually going to pull that up. So let's look at virtualbox.org. And virtualbox.org is owned by Sun Microsystems, and there it is. And you can just download it right there. Just click download and away you go. I'm going to click on the downloads here so you can see it. When it says hosts, it's talking about your PC. Right? The host, that term host comes from internet stuff. So this is a Windows PC, a Mac. They haven't changed it to Mac OS. PC or Linux PCs there. Solaris is a type of Unix, and you're not running those. Anyway, you just click it and you install this piece of software, and it is a hypervisor. That's exactly what it is. So we could put hypervisor equals VirtualBox. Internally, in when you take the 113 class, we use different software, but VirtualBox is free. It's easy to set up. Anyway, so the hypervisor is running, VirtualBox is running on top of this hardware. And then you can actually install your OS, right? So we can install, in their example, Windows 7, Windows 10, and Linux. And what's happening below that? Well, the hypervisor is virtualizing the hardware. You get the opportunity to go in, for instance, on this one and say, you know what, Windows 7, you get 1 gig of RAM. That's all you're going to get. In this version of Windows 7, it cannot see that you actually have 16 gigs. It can't see it because the hypervisor doesn't show it that. Windows 10, you can say you get 4 gigs of RAM. You get a hard disk the size of 26 gigs. And of course, it can't see that you have a 4 terabyte hard drive. It doesn't see that because the hypervisor is telling it what it gets. That makes things really dynamic. That makes it so that you can up the RAM if you want it, and you can increase the hard disk space or decrease it. You do a lot of stuff besides actually running different operating systems on there. I have students all the time, they'll go, well, I think I'm going to get an old computer and install Linux on it. Well, that's one option. Or you could just get VirtualBox and install Linux inside of it, and then you can see it running inside of Windows 10 and play with it all you want. It'll get on the internet. You can install the applications you want. Virtual machines are a big deal. They're becoming just a part of our life. And back to my story, 32 gigs of RAM. Again, the only time you'd really need that much is if you start running several virtual machines at a time. Because if I'm running all three of these at once, this one's going to take a gig, this one's going to take 4 gigs, and we'll say we'll give this one 2 gigs. So I got a total of 7 gigs of RAM that these operating systems in total want to use. And I've only got 8 on my system. So yeah, I'm going to see some bog downs because these are going to say, well, give me that RAM, give me that RAM. Same for hard disk space. You go around and make all these VMs and want to run 2 or 3 at a time. And now you're running into trouble with resources because you are sharing this out. That's all I'm going to explain here because it's really all you need to know. If you have other questions, let me know. But we get into this in 113 quite a lot, and we get into it in networking, and virtual machines, again, are a big part of our lives these days. And again, CMP 255 is all about doing that on a real server without running Windows 10 and then something on top of it, actually having the hypervisor on the bare metal. Anyway, why would you do this in IT fundamentals? Because it's very common in an IT department for you to have virtual machines running so that you're doing testing for compatibility, that kind of thing. Before you roll out a piece of software to 1,000 people, you may want to test it to make sure it's not going to screw up 98 of them. And so you run that kind of stuff for compatibility, for testing. There's the testing there. And then backups are easy to do on it because you can take snapshots. I don't want to get into it much further though. Yeah, there's a lot we could get into.